Well, here we are, Saturday, November 5th, 2022. I'm Larissa. We are reading To a God Unknown by John Steinbeck. Chapter 7. In Monterey, there lived and worked a harness maker and saddler named McGregor, a furious philosopher, a Marxian for the sake of argument. Age had not softened his ferocious opinions, and he had left the gentle utopia of Marx far behind. McGregor had long, deep wrinkles on his cheeks from constantly setting his jaw and pinching his mouth against the world. His eyes drooped with sullenness. He sued his neighbors for an infringement of his rights, and he was constantly discovering how inadequate was the law's cognizance of his rights. He tried to browbeat his daughter Elizabeth and failed as miserably as he had with her mother, for Elizabeth set her mouth and held her opinions out of reach of his arguments by never stating them. It infuriated the old man to think that he could not blast her prejudices with his own because he did not know what they were. Elizabeth was a pretty girl and very determined. Her hair was fluffy, her nose small, and her chin firm from setting it against her father. It was in her eyes that her beauty lay. Gray eyes set extremely far apart and lashed so thickly that they seemed to guard remote and preternatural knowledge. She was a tall girl, not thin, but lean with strength and taut with quick and nervous energy. Her father pointed out her faults, or rather, faults he thought she had. "You're like your mother," he said. "Your mind is closed. You've no single shred of reason. Everything you do is the way you feel about it. Take your mother, now. A Highland woman and straight from home. Her own father and mother believed in fairies, and when I put it up to her like a joke, she'd shoot her jaw and shut up her mouth like a window, and she'd say, 'There's things that won't stand reason, but are so just the same.' I'll take a wager your mother filled you with fairies before she died." And he modeled her future for her. "There's a time coming," he said prophetically, "when women will earn their own bread. There's no reason why a woman can't learn a trade. Take you, for instance," he said. "There's a time coming, and not far off either, when a girl like you will be making her wage and be damned to the first man that wants to marry her." McGregor was shocked, nevertheless, when Elizabeth began studying for country examinations so she could be a teacher. McGregor almost went soft. "You're too young, Elizabeth," he argued. "You're only 17. Give your bones a chance to get hard at least." But Elizabeth smiled slightly in triumph and said nothing. In a house where the littlest statement automatically marshaled crushing forces of argument against itself, she had learned to be silent. The profession of school teaching was something more than child instructing to a girl of spirit. When she turned 17, she could take country examinations and go adventuring. It was a decent means of leaving her home and her own town where people knew her too well, a means of preserving the alert and shatterable dignity of a young girl. To the community where she was sent, she was unknown and mysterious and desirable. She knew fractions and poetry, and she could read a little French and throw a word of it into conversation. Sometimes she wore underclothes of lawn or even silk, as could be seen when her laundry was on the line. These things, which might have been considered uppish in an ordinary person, were admired and expected in a school teacher, for she was a person of social as well as educational importance, and she gave an intellectual and cultural tone to her district. The people among whom she went to live did not know her baby name. She assumed the title Miss. The mantle of mystery and learning enveloped her, and she was 17. If within 6 months she did not marry the most eligible bachelor in the district, she must be ugly as a gorgon, for a school teacher could bring social elevation to a man. Her children were thought to be more intelligent than ordinary children. School teaching could be, if the teacher wished to make it so, a subtle and certain move towards matrimony. Elizabeth McGregor was even more widely educated than most teachers. In addition to fractions and French, she had read excerpts from Plato and Lucretius, and knew several titles of Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and Euphrates, and had a classical background resting on Homer and Virgil. After she had passed the examinations, she was assigned to a school in Nuestra Senora. The isolation of the place pleased Elizabeth. She wanted to think over all the things she knew, to arrange them in their places, and from their eventual arrangement, to construct the new Elizabeth McGregor. In the village of Our Lady, she went to board with the Gonzales family. Word flew through the valley that the new teacher was young and very pretty, and thereafter, when Elizabeth went out, when she walked to school or hurried to the grocery, she met young men who, though idle, were intensely preoccupied with their watches, with the rolling of a cigarette or some vague but vital spot in the distance. But occasionally there was one strange man among the loiterers who was preoccupied with Elizabeth, a tall man, black bearded, and with sharp blue eyes. This man bothered Elizabeth, for he stared at her when she passed, and his eyes pierced through her clothing. When Joseph heard about the new teacher, he drew in upon her in lessening circles until at last he sat in the Gonzales's parlor, a carpeted, respectable place, and he stared across at Elizabeth. It was a formal call. Elizabeth's soft hair was poofed on her head, but she was the teacher. Her face wore a formal expression, almost stern, except that she smoothed down her skirt over her knees again and again. She might have been composed. At intervals, she looked up into the searching eyes of Joseph and then looked away again. Joseph wore a black suit and new boots. His hair and beard were trimmed, and his nails were as clean as he could get them. "Do you like poetry?" Elizabeth asked, looking for a moment into the sharp, unmoving eyes. "Oh, yes, I like it, what I've read of it." "Of course, Mr. Wayne, there are no modern poets like the Greeks, like Homer." Joseph's face became impatient. "I remember," he said, "of course, I remember. A man went to an island and got changed into a pig." Elizabeth's mouth pinched at the corners. In an instant she was the teacher, remote and above the pupil. "That is the Odyssey," she said. "Homer is thought to have lived about 900 BC. He had a profound effect on all Greek literature." "Miss McGregor," Joseph said earnestly, "there's a way to do this thing, but I don't know it. Some people seem to know by instinct, but I don't. Before I came, I tried to think of what I'd say to you, but I couldn't discover a way, because I've never done anything like this before. There's a time of fencing to go through, and I don't know how to do it. Besides, it all seems useless to me." Elizabeth was caught by his eyes now, and she was startled by the intensity of his speech. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Wayne." She had been flung from her seat of learning, and the fall frightened her. "I know I'm doing it all wrong," he said. "I don't know any other way. You see, Miss McGregor, I'm afraid I might get confused and embarrassed. I want you to be my wife, and you must know it. My brothers and I own 640 acres of land. Our blood is clean. I think I should be good to you if I know what you want." He had dropped his eyes while he talked. Now he looked up and saw that she was flushing and looking very miserable. Joseph jumped to his feet. "I suppose I've done it wrong. Now I'm confused, but I got it out first, and now I'll go, Miss McGregor. I'll come back after we've stopped being embarrassed." He hurried out without saying goodbye, leapt on his horse, and galloped away into the night. There was a burn of shame and of exultance in his throat. When he came to the wooded river bottom, he pulled up his horse, rose in his stirrups, and shouted to ease the burn, and the echo blatted back at him. The night was very black, and a high mist dulled the sharpness of the stars and muffled the night noises. His cry had blasted a thick silence and frightened him. For a moment he sat dumbly in his saddle and felt the swell and fall of his panting horse. "This night is too still," he said, "too unimpressed. I must do something." He felt that the time required a sign, an act to give it point. Somehow an act of his must identify him with the moment that was passing, or it would slip away, taking no part of him with it. He whipped off his hat and flung it away into the dark, but this was not enough. He felt for his quirt where it hung from the saddle horn and plucked it off, lashed his own leg viciously to make a moment of pain. The horse plunged aside, away from the whistle of the blow, and then reared. Joseph threw his quirt away into the brush, controlled the horse with a powerful pressure of his knees, and when it was quieted, trotted the nervous animal toward the ranch. Joseph opened his mouth to let the cool air into his throat. Elizabeth watched the door close behind him. There was too big a crack under that door, she thought. "When the wind blows, a draft will come in under the door. I wonder if I should move to another house." She spread her skirt tightly down, then drew her fingers up the center so that the cloth adhered to her legs and defined their shape. She inspected her fingers carefully. Now I am ready, she went on. Now I am ready to punish him. He is a bumpkin, a blundering fool. He has no manners. He doesn't know how to do things politely. He wouldn't know manners if he saw them. I don't like his beard. He stares too much. And his suit is pitiful. She thought over the punishment and nodded her head slowly. He said he didn't know how to fence, and he wants to marry me. I'd have to bear those eyes all my life. His beard is probably coarse, but I don't think so. No, I don't think so. What a fine thing to go straight to a point. And his suit! And he would put his hand on my side? Her mind bolted away. I wonder what I will do. The person who must act in the future was a stranger whose reactions Elizabeth did not quite understand. She walked up the stairs to her bedroom and slowly took off her clothes. I must look at his palm next time. That will tell. She nodded gravely and then threw herself face downward on the bed and cried. Her crying was as satisfying and as luxurious as a morning's yawn. After a while, she got up and blew out her lamp and dragged a little velvet-seated rocking chair to the window. Resting her elbows on the window-sill, she looked out into the night. There was a heavy, misty dampness in the air now. A lighted window down the rutted street was fringed with light. Elizabeth heard a stealthily movement in the yard below and leaned to look out. There was a pounce, a hissing, rasping cry, and then the crunch of bone. Her eyes pierced the gray darkness and made out a long, low, shadowy cat creeping away with some little creature in its mouth. A nervous bat circled her head, gritting as it looked about. Now I wonder where he is, she thought. He'll be riding now, and his beard will be blowing. When he gets home, he'll be very tired, and I'm here, resting, doing nothing. It serves him right. She heard a concertina playing, coming nearer from the other end of the village, where the saloon was. As it drew close, a voice joined, a voice as sweet and hopeless as a tired sigh. Max Welton's braes are bonny. Two lurching figures were passing by. Stop! You're not playing the right tune. Keep your damn Mexican tunes out of this now. Max Welton's braes are bonny. Wrong again! The men paused. I wish I could play the blasted squeeze organ. You can try, senor. Try? Hell, I have tried. It only belches when I try. He paused. Shall we try again, senor? This Max Welton. One of the men moved close to the fence. Elizabeth could see him looking up at her window. Come down, he pleaded. Please come down. Elizabeth sat very still, afraid to move. I'll send the cholo along home. Senor, no cholos to me. I'll send the gentleman along home if you come down. I am lonely. No, she said, and her voice startled her. I'll sing to you if you'll come down. Listen how I can sing. Play, Pancho. Play Sobre los olas. His voice filled the air like vaporized gold, and his voice was filled with delicious sorrow. The song finished so softly that she leaned forward to hear. Now will you come down? I'm waiting for you. She shuddered violently and, reaching up, pulled the window down, but even through the glass she could hear the voice. She won't, Pancho. How about the next house? Old people, senor, 80 nearly. And the next house? Well, maybe. A little girl, 13. We'll try the little girl, 13, then. Now, Max Welton's braes are bonny. Elizabeth had pulled the covers over her head, and she was shivering with fright. I would have gone, she said miserably. I'm afraid I would have gone if he had asked again. 8. Joseph allowed 2 weeks to pass before he went again to call on Elizabeth. The fall was coming hazily, graying the sky with high mist. Huge puffy cotton clouds sailed in from the ocean every day and sat on the hilltops for a while, and then retired to the sea again like reconnoitering knaves of the sky. The red-winged blackbirds massed their squadrons and practiced at maneuvering over the fields. The doves, unseen in the spring and summer, came from their hiding and sat in clusters on fences and dead trees. The sun, in its rising and setting, was red behind the autumn veil of airborne dust. Burton had taken his wife and gone to a camp meeting in Pacific Grove. Thomas said wryly, He's eating God the way a bear eats meat against the winter. Thomas was sad with the coming winter. He seemed to fear the wet and windy time when he could find no cave to crawl into. The children on the ranch began to consider Christmas as not too far buried in the future for anticipation. They addressed guarded questions to Rama concerning the kind of conduct most admired by the saints of the solstice, and Rama made the most of their apprehension. Benji was lazily ill. His young wife tried to understand why no one paid much attention. There was little to be done on the ranch. The tall, dry grass on the foothills was thick enough to feed the stock all winter. The barns were full of hay for the horses. Joseph spent a great deal of time sitting under the oak trees, thinking of Elizabeth. He could remember how she sat, with her feet close together and her head held high, as though it was only restrained from flying upward of being attached by being attached to her body. Juanito came and sat beside him and looked secretly at Joseph's face to read his temper and to imitate it. I might be having a wife before spring, Juanito, Joseph said. Right in my house here, living here. She'd ring a little bell when it came dinner time, not a cowbell. I would buy a little silver bell. I guess you'd like to hear a little bell like that, Juanito, ringing at dinner time. And Juanito, flattered at the confidence, uncovered his own secret. I too, senor. A wife, Juanito? You too? Yes, senor. Alice Garcia. They have a paper to prove their grandfather was Castilian. Why, I'm glad of that, Juanito. We'll help you build a house here, and then you won't be a rider any more. You'll live here. Juanito giggled with happiness. I'll have a bell, senor, hanging beside the porch, but a cowbell, me. It wouldn't be good to hear your bell come from my dinner. Joseph tilted back his head and smiled up at the twisted branches of the tree. Several times he had thought of whispering about Elizabeth, but a shame at doing a thing so silly had forbidden it. I'm going to drive to town day after tomorrow, Juanito. I guess you'll want to go with me. Oh, yes, senor. I'll sit in the buckboard, and you can say, he is my driver. He is good with horses. Of course, I never drive myself. Joseph laughed at the rider. I guess you'd like me to do the same for you. Oh, no, senor, not I. We'll go in early, Juanito. You should have a new suit for a time like this. Juanito stared at him incredulously. A suit, senor? Not overalls? A suit with a coat? Why, a coat and a vest, and for a wedding present, a watch chain for the vest. It is too much, senor, Juanito said. I have a broken cincha to fix. And he walked away towards the barn, for it would be necessary to think a good deal about a suit and a watch chain. His manner of wearing such a costume would require consideration and some practice. Joseph leaned back against the tree, and the smile slowly left his eyes. He looked again into the branches. A colony of hornets had made a button on a limb above his head, and around this nucleus they were beginning to construct their papery nest. To Joseph's mind, there leapt the memory of the round glade among the pines. He remembered every detail of the place, the curious moss-covered rock, the dark cave with its fringe of ferns, and the silent, clear water flowing out and hurrying stealthily away. He saw how the cress grew in the water and how it moved its leaves in the current. Suddenly, Joseph wanted to go to that place, to sit by the rock and to stroke the soft moss. It would be a place to run to, away from the pain or sorrow or disappointment or fear, he thought. But I have no such need now. I have none of these things to run from. I must remember this place, though. If there's ever need to lose some plaguing thing, that will be the place to go. And he remembered how the tall trunks grew up and how peacefulness was almost a touchable thing in the glade. I must look inside the cave sometime and see where the spring is, he thought. Juanito spent the whole next day working on the harness, the two bay driving horses, and the buckboard. He washed and polished, curried and brushed, and then, fearing he had missed some potential brightness, he went through the whole process again. The brass knob on the pole glittered fiercely, every buckle was silver, the harness shone like patent leather, a bow of red ribbon fluttered from the middle of the whip. Before noon on the great day, he had the equipage out, to listen for squeaks in the newly greased wagon. At length he slipped the bridle and tied the horses in the shade before he went in to lunch with Joseph. Neither of them ate very much, a slice or two of bread torn in pieces and dropped in milk. They finished, nodded at each other, and rose from the table. In the buckboard, patiently waiting for them, was Benji. Joseph grew angry. You shouldn't go, Benji. You've been sick. I'm well again, said Benji. I'm taking Juanito. There won't be room for you. Benji smiled disarmingly. I'll sit in the box, he said, and he climbed over the seat and half reclined on the boards. They started off over the rough-wheeled tracks, and their spirits were a little dampened by Benji's presence. Joseph leaned back over the seat. You mustn't drink anything, Benji. You've been sick. Oh, no, I'm going in to get a new clock. Remember what I say, Benji. I don't want you to drink. I wouldn't swallow a drop, Joe, not even if it was in my mouth. Joseph gave him up. He knew that Benji would be drunk within an hour of his arrival, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. The sycamores along the creek were beginning to drop their leaves on the ground. The road was deep in the crisp brown fragments. Joseph lifted the lines of the horses and broke into a trot, and their hooves crashed softly in the leaves. Elizabeth heard Joseph's voice on the porch and hurried upstairs so she could come down again. She was afraid of Joseph Wayne. Since his last visit, she had thought of him nearly all the time. How could she refuse to marry him even though she hated him? Some terrible thing might happen if she should refuse. He might die, or perhaps he might strike her with his fist. In her room, before she went down to the parlor, she brought out all her knowledge to protect her. Her algebra, and when Caesar landed in England, and Nicene Council, and the verb être. Joseph didn't know things like that. Probably the only date he knew was 1776. An ignorant man, really. Her mouth pinched at the corners with contempt. Her eyes grew stern. She would put him in his place, and she would smart aleck as she would a smart aleck boy in school. Elizabeth ran her fingers around her wrist. Elizabeth ran her fingers around her waist inside her skirt to make sure that her skirt waist was tucked in. She patted her hair, rubbed her lips harshly with her knuckles to bring the blood to the surface, and last blew out the lamp. She came majestically into the parlor where Joseph stood. "Good evening," she said. "I was reading when they told me you were here. Pippa passes Browning. Do you like Browning, Mr. Wayne?" He raked a nervous hand through his hair and destroyed the careful part. "Have you decided yet?" he demanded. "I must ask you that first. I don't know who Browning is." He was staring at her eyes, so hungry, so beseeching, that her superiority dropped away from her and her facts crawled back into their cells. Her hands made a helpless gesture. I don't know," she said. "I'll go away again. You aren't ready now. That is, unless you'd like to talk about Browning, or maybe you'd like to go out for a drive. I came in the buckboard." Elizabeth stared downward at the green carpet with its brown footpath where the pile had been worn through, and her eyes moved to Joseph's boots, glittering with daubed polish, which was not black but iridescent, green and blue and purple. Elizabeth's mind fastened on the shoes and felt safe for a moment. The polish was old, she thought. He probably had the bottle for a long time, and he left the cork out. That always makes the colors in it. Black ink does the same thing when it's left open. He doesn't know that, I guess, and I won't tell him. If I told him, I wouldn't have any privacy anymore. And she wondered why he didn't move his feet. "We could drive down by the river," Joseph said. "The river is fine, but it's very dangerous to cross on foot. The stones are slippery, you see. You must not cross on foot, but we could drive down there." He wanted to tell her how the wheels would sound, crushing the crisp leaves, and how a long blue spark with a head like a serpent's tongue would leap from the crash of iron, the stone now and then. He wanted to say how the sky was low this night, so low that one bathed one's head in it. There seemed no way to say such things. "I'd like you to go," he said. He took a short step toward her and destroyed the safety her mind had founded. Elizabeth had a quick impulse to be gay. She put her hand timidly on his arm and patted his sleeve. "I'll go," she said, hearing an unnecessary loudness in her voice. "I think I'd like to go. Teaching is a strain. I need to be out in the air." She ran upstairs for her coat, humming under her breath, and at the top of the stairs she pointed her toe twice, as little girls do in a maypole dance. "Now I'm committing myself," she thought. "People will see us driving alone at night, and that will mean we are engaged." Joseph stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked upward, waiting for her to reappear. He felt a desire to open his body for her inspection, so that she could see all the hidden things in him, even the things he didn't know were there. That would be right, he thought. Then she would know the kind of man I am, and if she knew that, she would be part of me. She paused on the landing and smiled down at him. Over her shoulders she wore a long blue cape, and some of her hair was loose from its puff and caught in the nape of the blue wool. A rush of tenderness came over Joseph for the loose hairs. He laughed sharply. "Come quickly before the horse fades," he said, "or the moment goes, or, of course, I mean the polished Juanito put on the harness." He opened the door for her, and when they reached the buckboard, he helped her to the near seat before he untied the horses and fastened the ivory loops of their check reins. The horses danced a little, and Joseph was glad of that. "Are you warm?" he asked. "Yes, warm." The horses broke into a trot. Joseph saw how he could make a gesture with his arms and hands that would sweep in and indicate and symbolize the The ripe stars and the whole cusp of the sky, the land eddied with black trees, and the crested waves that were the mountains, an earth storm, frozen in the peak of its rushing, or stone breakers moving eastward with infinite slowness. Joseph wondered whether there were any words to say these things. He said, I like the night. It's more strong than day. From the first moment of her association with him, Elizabeth had been tense to repel his attack upon her boundaried and fortified self. But now a strange and sudden thing had happened. Perhaps the tone, the rhythm, perhaps some personal implication in his words had done it, had swept her walls cleanly away. She touched his arm with her fingertips and trembled with delight and drew away. Her throat tightened above her breathing. She thought, he will hear me panting like a horse. This is disgraceful. And she laughed nervously under her breath, knowing she didn't care. Those thoughts she had kept weak and pale, hidden in the recesses of her brain, just out of thinking vision, came out into the open, and she saw that they were not foul and loathsome like slugs, as she had always believed, but somehow light and gay and holy. If he should put his lips upon my breast, I would be glad, she thought. The pressure of gladness in me would be more than I could stand. I would hold my breast to his lips with both hands. She saw herself doing it, and she knew how she would feel, pouring the hot fluid of herself towards his lips. The horses snorted loudly and swung to one side of the road, for a dark figure stood in front of them. Juanito walked quickly beside the wagon to talk to Joseph. Are you going home, senor? I was waiting. No, Juanito, not for some time. I'll wait again, senor. Benji is drunk. Joseph twisted nervously in his seat. I guess I knew he would be. He is out on the road, senor. I heard him sing a little while ago. Willie Romas is drunk, too. Willie is happy. Willie will kill someone tonight, maybe. Joseph's hands were white in the starlight, holding the lines taut, jerking forward a little when the horses flung their heads against the bits. Find Benji, Joseph said bitterly. I'll be ready to go in a couple of hours. The horses leapt forward, and Juanito sank away into the darkness. Now that her wall was down, Elizabeth could feel that Joseph wasn't happy. He will tell me, and then I will help him. Joseph sat rigid, and the horses, feeling the uncompromising weight of his clenched hands on the lines, slowed their trot to a careful picking walk. They were nearing the ragged black barrier of the river trees when suddenly the voice of Benji sounded from the cover of the harsh brush. Estando bebiendo de vivo, Pedro, Rodarte y Simon. Joseph tore the whip from its socket and lashed the horses ferociously, and then he had to put all his force on the line to check their leaping. Elizabeth was crying miserably because of the voice of Benji. Joseph pulled up the horses until the crashing of the hooves on the hard road subsided to the intricate rhythm of a trot. I have not told you my brother is a drunkard. You'll have to know the kind of family I have. My brother is a drunkard. I do not mean he goes out and gets drunk now and then, the way any man will. Benji has the disease in his body. Now you know. He stared ahead of him. That was my brother singing there. He felt her body jerking against her side as she wept. Do you want me to take you home now? Yes. Do you want me to stay away? When she made no reply, he turned the horses sharply and started them back. Do you want me to stay away from you? He demanded. No, she said. I'm being silly. I want to go home and go to bed. I want to try to know what it is that I'm feeling. This is an honesty. Joseph felt an exultance rising again in his throat. He leaned toward her and kissed her on her cheek, and then touched up the horses again. At the gate, he helped her down and walked to the door with her. I will go now to try to find my brother. In a few days, I will come back. Good night. Elizabeth didn't wait to see him go. She was in bed almost before the sound of the wheels died out. Her heart pounded so that it shook her head against the pillow. It was hard to listen over the pounding of her heart, but at last she made out the sound she was waiting for. It came slowly toward her house, the drunken, beautiful voice. Elizabeth gathered her spirit to resist the flaming pain that was coming with the voice. She whispered to herself, he is useless, I know. A drunken, useless fool. I have something to do, almost a magic thing. She waited until the voice came in front of the house. Now I must do this. It is the only chance. She put her head under the pillow and whispered, I love this singing man. Useless as he is, I love him. I have never seen his face, and I love him more than anything. Lord Jesus, help me to my desire. Help me to have this man. Then she lay quietly, listening for the response. For the answer to her magic, it came after a last splash of pain. A hatred for Benji drove out the pain, a hatred so powerful that her jaws tightened and her lips drew snarlingly back from her teeth. She could feel how her skin tingled with the hatred and how her nails ached to attack him. And then the hatred floated off and away. She heard without interest the voice of Benji growing fainter in the distance. Elizabeth lay on her back now and rested her head on crossed wrists. Now I will be married soon, she said quietly. Now, it's interesting to think about. It's interesting to think about like the process of dating and choosing a mate historically in this time period, and looking at it this way, and having read, also having read, Pride and Prejudice, and and having other British authors, very very different, very 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 different sense of romance. And there's the practicality in the character of Joseph Wayne is startling. And upon first introduction to Elizabeth, I don't like her. Now, for me in the book, it is something that changes, but I don't like her. And I'm not saying that I think that Joseph Wayne is particularly likable either. But there's an evolution that happens in this relationship, and it's important to come back and remember the beginning. It's important to come back and remember the beginning, as it is with any relationship in real life, right? Anyway, school teacher. You can be a school teacher. What a reward. It's interesting to think of it in that context now, There used to be some very strange laws for school teachers. Some very, very strange laws. Anyway.